Number 1. Sexual slavery and ritual killing by the Vikings. The Old Norse word thrall derives from a root meaning to run or to be compelled. Thralls occupied the absolute lowest class in Norse society. They had zero legal protections, not reduced protections, none. From the Lindisfarne raid of 793 AD onward, capturing women was as important as seizing gold. There was a slave economy from its inception. Dublin emerged as a major Viking slave trading hub. Archaeological evidence suggests the Irish slave trade was one of the most lucrative Norse enterprises of the 9th and 10th centuries. The city functioned as a clearinghouse for human cargo. The most disturbing primary source we possess is Ibn Fadlan's 921 AD eyewitness account. During a chieftain's ship burial, a slave girl was made to drink heavily. She was then assaulted by 6 men in succession. This was called a ritual honor. Afterward, she was simultaneously strangled and stabbed by a woman referred to as the Angel of Death. Ibn Fadlan, a Muslim diplomat, watched it happen and wrote it down. His account survives because it was filed as a bureaucratic travel report. Hedabia and Burka served as major slave markets. Women captured from England, Ireland, Francia, and Slavic lands passed through these trading centers. The etymological connection is revealing. The word Slavic may derive from the Latin sklavos, meaning slave. The term reflects how heavily Eastern European women were targeted by Viking and medieval slave traders. Norse law codes like the Gragas stated explicitly that a thrall owner could do virtually anything to their property. Sexual assault carried no legal penalty. Children born to thrall women inherited their mother's status regardless of paternity. If the father was a free man, it did not matter. The child was a thrall. This was a self-perpetuating slave caste encoded in law. The Landnámabók records that Iceland's founding settlers brought Irish and Scottish thrall women with them. Modern DNA studies confirm significant Celtic maternal lineage in the Icelandic population. A landmark 2018 genetic study published in Science found that Norse-era Scandinavian women had considerably less genetic diversity than men. The interpretation is direct. Many settlement women were captives brought from abroad. The DNA does not lie about this. Viking slave routes extended from Ireland to Constantinople and Baghdad. Women sometimes passed through multiple markets across thousands of miles before reaching a final owner. Rus Vikings specifically targeted Slavic women for Constantinople and Abbasid markets, where light-skinned women commanded premium prices. The Ridgeway Hill burial in Dorset tells a story through absence. 54 decapitated Viking-age men were found there, no women. The women were separated and taken. Adam of Bremen, writing around 1075, described Hidabi's slave market as one of northern Europe's largest. Humans were displayed and traded like livestock. Thrall women performed the most grueling labor. They ground grain, processed wool, tended livestock. They were available for sexual exploitation at all times. Freeing a thrall was rare and conditional. A freed thrall woman still owed obligations to her former master. Limited rights persisted for generations. Christianity gradually curtailed thrall taking between the 10th and 12th centuries, but the practice faded over generations rather than ending by decree. The mainstream theory holds that slave taking was an economic engine fundamental to Norse expansion. The archaeological theory, supported by genetic evidence, reveals that captive women's contribution was far larger than textual sources suggest. A fringe theory argues that the saga tradition deliberately minimized thrall taking to construct a heroic national narrative. It took DNA science to recover the women written out of the story. Centuries of Viking mythology replaced the slave economy with warrior adventure. But the Vikings, for all their brutality, operated through raids and market networks. They lacked the administrative machinery to industrialize captive taking at a state level. For that, we have to look much further back in time to the river valleys of Mesopotamia, where an empire turned the capture of women into bureaucratic science. Number 2, industrialized deportation and mutilation by the Assyrians. 4.5 million people. That is the estimated number of human beings deported across the Assyrian Empire between the 9th and 7th centuries BC. Women and children made up the majority. We know this not from guesswork or legend, but from cuneiform tablets. Accountants carved these records into clay. They cataloged human beings alongside grain, livestock, and metals. This was not chaos. This was bookkeeping. Where the Vikings kept no written records of their slave economy, The Assyrians documented every detail of theirs. The annals of Ashurnasirpal II are among the most disturbing official documents ever produced by a state. His royal inscriptions describe flaying captives alive, impaling prisoners on stakes, and constructing pillars from severed heads. These were not battlefield rumors, this was official communication. The king wanted his subjects and his enemies to read these things. At the city of Suru, Ashurnasirpal personally ordered noses, ears, and fingers cut from women captives as collective punishment for rebellion. The mutilations were listed with the same specificity a modern government might use in a policy memo. In administrative texts, captive women carried the classification shalatu, meaning spoils of the bow. The term placed them in the same category as seized grain and confiscated bronze. This was linguistic dehumanization embedded inside the bureaucracy itself. The language did not describe what had happened to them, it described what they now were. Property, palace reliefs at Nimrud and Nineveh show long columns of women march barefoot, their hands are bound, children cling to them. These carvings were not hidden records of shame. They were propaganda carved deliberately into stone walls where foreign diplomats would see them. The message was strategic: resist, and this is what awaits your wives and daughters. Tiglath-Pileser III, who ruled from 745 to 727 BC, transformed deportation from a sporadic punishment into formal imperial policy. He scattered conquered populations deliberately to break ethnic bonds and destroy family structures. The deportation column stretched hundreds of miles from Babylon, Samaria, and Lachish to the Assyrian heartland. Survival rates are unknown but presumed catastrophic. People walked for weeks under guard through hostile terrain with minimal provisions. The fall of Lachish in 701 BC under Sennacherib became one of the most visually documented sieges in ancient history. Massive palace reliefs show women being led away in one panel while men are impaled in the background. The juxtaposition was not accidental. It was carved into stone with deliberate purpose. Different fates for different genders, both of them terrible. Administrative tablets recovered from Nineveh record ration allocations for deportee, women, and children. The amounts were set at bare subsistence, just enough calories to keep them working, not enough to keep them healthy. The Assyrians understood that a dead laborer produces nothing, and a well-fed one might resist. The ration numbers split the difference. Sennacherib's destruction of Babylon in 689 BC went further than any previous campaign. The entire surviving female population was enslaved. Then, the city itself was flooded. The goal was not simply conquest, it was erasure. Esarhaddon, who followed, boasted of making the wives and daughters of defeated kings grind grain in the palace of Nineveh. This was deliberate status inversion. Women who had once commanded servants were forced into the most physically grueling domestic labor. The humiliation was the point. Forced religious conversion followed. Captive women were compelled to serve in temples of Ashur and Ishtar. Original spiritual identities were methodically destroyed. Women who attempted escape or resistance were publicly mutilated. Texts reference cutting of breasts and branding as deterrent punishments. These were not secret atrocities. They were performed where other captive women could see them. The fall of Samaria in 722 BC resulted in 27,290 Israelites deported by Sargon II. Both biblical and Assyrian records confirm this number independently. Women and children formed the bulk of the deportees. Ashurbanipal's campaigns against Elam resulted in the enslavement of Elamite queens, and their humiliation was carved into stone reliefs intended to last for eternity. Psychological warfare was integral to the system. Assyrian envoys arrived at besieged cities and described in graphic detail what awaited women if the city did not surrender. The tactic worked because the threats were credible. Everyone knew the Assyrians followed through. Captive women with skills in weaving, dyeing, or brewing were specifically targeted for workshop labor. They formed an industrial slave force in Assyrian cities, their skills extracted, and their output measured by the same scribes who recorded grain harvests. Three frameworks compete to explain all of this. The mainstream theory holds that this was empire building through calculated terror and population management. The archaeological theory emphasizes economics. Deportation was primarily labor redistribution, not just punishment. And a fringe theory argues that Assyrian cruelty has been exaggerated by biblical sources, which had theological motivations to portray the Assyrians as divine instruments of punishment. Each of these theories has defenders. Each of them has evidence. When Nineveh fell in 612 BC, the Babylonian Median coalition reportedly subjected the Assyrian population to identical treatment. The victims of one century became the perpetrators of the next, and the system reset itself on new bodies. The Assyrians perfected the bureaucracy of captive taking, but even their deportation columns, stretching hundreds of miles, pale in comparison to the next entry on this list, where millions of women were seized across entire continents in a matter of decades. Number 3. Mass capture and forced concubinage by the Mongols. Conservative estimates place the death toll of the Mongol conquests at 40 million people. That was roughly 10% of the world's population. Women taken captive likely numbered in the millions across a century of campaigns. The Yasa, the Mongol legal code, codified the distribution of war spoils, including captive women. Specific percentages were allocated to officers of different ranks. A commander of 10,000 received more women than a commander of 100. It was systematized human trafficking with a chain of command. At the fall of Urgench in 1221, the Persian historian Juvayni records the surviving population of over 100,000 divided among soldiers. Women were separated from men and distributed individually. Rashid al-Din's history, the Jami al-Tawarikh, compiled around 1307, repeatedly documents mass taking of women after every major siege. It is one of the most comprehensive primary sources on the practice. The destruction of Merv that same year overwhelmed the chroniclers. Claims of over 1 million killed have been revised downward by modern historians, but even conservative numbers place the scale of killing and captive taking as enormous. The quote attributed to Genghis Khan through Rashid al-Din distills the philosophy. The greatest happiness is to vanquish enemies, rob their wealth, see their loved ones weep, and clasp their wives and daughters to your chest. In 2003, a landmark study in the American Journal of Human Genetics found that approximately 8% of men in the former Mongol Empire carry a Y chromosome lineage traceable to Genghis Khan's era. That is roughly 16 million men alive today. The implication is extraordinary. Reproductive access to captive women on a scale that rewrote the genetic map of Asia. The surrender or die system ensured that women in resisting cities faced the worst outcomes. This was calculated. At Baghdad in 1258, the Abbasid caliph's wives, concubines, and daughters were distributed among Mongol commanders. The caliph himself was rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses. Women with specific skills were separated and sent to Karakorum, the Mongol capital. Sometimes they traveled thousands of miles under armed guard. Forced political marriages compelled daughters of conquered rulers to marry Mongol nobles. At the siege of Nishapur in 1221, where orders were given to kill every living thing, Juvayni describes women throwing themselves into rivers, off walls, and into fires, rather than be taken alive. The army's speed meant a woman taken in Central Asia could find herself in China, Korea, or Eastern Europe within months. Return was impossible. Marco Polo describes Kublai Khan's court filled with women selected from conquered populations, rotated in groups for the Khan's personal service. The siege of Kiev in 1240 resulted in near-total destruction and mass enslavement of surviving women, reshaping regional demographics for generations. Persian and Arab chroniclers consistently note that craftswomen and beautiful women were separated into a distinct luxury goods category. Information warfare used captive women as tools. Mongols sometimes released a handful to spread panic about what awaited those who resisted. The mainstream theory treats captive taking as integrated military-political strategy. The genetic theory argues the Y chromosome evidence reveals reproductive coercion at unprecedented scale. A fringe theory contends that chroniclers like Juvayni exaggerated figures to glorify conquests. Regions like Khwarezm took centuries to recover pre-invasion populations. The loss of women of childbearing age was the key factor. But if the Mongols captured women through mobile warfare, the Romans turned captivity into public theater. Number 4. Women paraded and strangled as war trophies by the Romans. The Roman triumph was a formal military procession. Captive women and children walked in chains before the general's chariot. They were displayed alongside looted treasure, painted scenes of battle, and exotic animals. They were literally equated with plunder. Vercingetorix's wife and female family members were paraded after Caesar's Gallic triumph in 46 BC, then they likely were executed or enslaved. Their fate went unrecorded. No Roman historian considered it worth documenting. Queen Zenobia of Palmyra was displayed in golden chains during Aurelian's triumph in 274 AD. She was reportedly spared and given a villa. But this was an extraordinary exception. Cleopatra's sister Arsenio IV was paraded in Caesar's triumph. The crowd showed rare sympathy. She was initially spared but later executed on Mark Antony's orders. At the foot of the Capitoline Hill sat the Tullianum, also called the Mamertine prison. This was where captive leaders and their families were strangled immediately after the triumph ended. Crowds cheered above while executions happened below. Josephus describes the triumph after Jerusalem's fall in 70 AD in extraordinary detail. Jewish captives, including women, were displayed alongside temple treasures. An estimated 97,000 Jews were enslaved. Women were distributed across the empire for labor, arena spectacles, and domestic servitude. Roman law classified captive women as res mancipi, property acquired by force. The legal category was shared with land, draft animals, and certain livestock. After Aemilius Paulus's triumph over Macedon in 167 BC, 150,000 epirotes were sold into slavery in a single day. A huge proportion were women. The sudden flood of human merchandise crashed slave prices across the entire Mediterranean. Slave markets, called venalicia, had specific display protocols. Chalk was applied to captives' feet. Placards listed skills and national origin. Women were rotated on platforms. Cato the Elder wrote matter-of-factly about managing slave women on farms. He recommended specific breeding and work schedules as if discussing livestock management. Captive women who bore children to Roman masters had no legal claim to those children. Children were the master's property and could be sold separately. The Senatus Consultum Silanianum, enacted in 10 AD, mandated that all slaves in a household be tortured and executed if their master was murdered, women included. Mass suicides at Numantia in 133 BC and Masada in 73 AD suggest captive women fully understood what Roman captivity meant and considered death preferable. Rome's slave population at its peak reached an estimated 2 to 3 million people. A significant portion were captive women from conquered territories around the Mediterranean. The mainstream theory treats triumphs as religious ceremonies with captive display as essential ritual. The archaeological theory points to the sheer volume of slave-related infrastructure, suggesting an economy structurally dependent on captive women's labor. A fringe theory argues Roman historians inflated triumph narratives for political propaganda. The Roman system lasted centuries. But another slave trade lasted even longer, and its silence is even more complete. Number 5. 12 centuries of concubinage by Arab slave traders. The Arab and Islamic slave trade lasted roughly 1,200 years. That is significantly longer than the transatlantic trade, which lasted roughly 400 years. Yet it receives a fraction of scholarly and public attention. Conservative estimates place 10 to 18 million Africans enslaved through trans-Saharan, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean routes. Women consistently commanded higher prices than men. The demand was for domestic labor and concubinage. The Quran permitted concubinage with those whom your right hand possesses. This phrase was interpreted as sanctioning sexual access to enslaved women. The religious justification spanned centuries. Major slave markets operated in Cairo, Baghdad, Damascus, Istanbul, Zanzibar, and Muscat. Women were displayed and physically inspected before sale. Multiple travelers describe this process in graphic detail. Castration of male slaves to create eunuch harem guards resulted in mortality rates estimated between 60 and 90%. The procedures were typically performed on boys before puberty using crude methods in remote locations, far from the markets where the survivors would be sold. Caucasian women, particularly Circassians and Georgians, were specifically prized. They commanded the highest prices in Ottoman and Arab markets, creating a centuries-long targeted trade in these populations. Ibn Battuta, the 14th century traveler, describes slave markets across the Islamic world with remarkable casualness. Prices, qualities, and origins of enslaved women are noted as routine commerce. The Zanj rebellion of 869 to 883 AD in southern Iraq involved an estimated 500,000 East African slaves. It was one of the largest slave revolts in history, illustrating the massive early scale of the trade. Enslaved women who bore children to their masters gained the theoretical legal status of walad and could not be sold. But enforcement was inconsistent, and the path to that status required enduring repeated assault. Zanzibar, under Omani rule in the 18th and 19th centuries, operated the largest East African slave market. An estimated 50,000 enslaved people passed through annually at peak. Huge numbers were women destined for households across the Arabian Peninsula. The trans-Saharan crossing itself was deadly. Enslaved people walked for weeks across desert. Skeletal remains along trade routes testify to those who did not survive. Unlike the Atlantic system, the Arab trade left fewer visible descendant communities. This resulted from high mortality, male castration, and absorption of concubine children into the master's family and ethnic group. The demographic invisibility contributes to the historiographical silence. Barbary corsairs between the 16th and 19th centuries enslaved an estimated 1 to 1.25 million Europeans from coastal raids on Italy, Spain, England, Ireland, and even Iceland. Women were specifically targeted for North African markets. Saudi Arabia did not formally abolish slavery until 1962. Mauritania not until 1981. The mainstream theory frames the trade as economically driven, shaped by legal religious frameworks that both enabled and partially constrained it. The archaeological theory argues that the demographic invisibility of descendants has artificially erased the trade scale. A fringe theory holds that the historiographical gap is partly political. Discussing the Arab slave trade has been complicated by concerns about fueling Islamophobia, creating a scholarly reluctance that amounts to a second erasure. While the Arab trade scattered women across continents, one Greek city-state kept its captive women in one place for 300 years. Number 6. 3 centuries of state-owned exploitation by the Spartans. Helots were the enslaved indigenous Messenians and Laconians, conquered around 735 to 715 BC. Their subjugation formed the economic foundation of the entire Spartan state for over 3 centuries. Unlike chattel slaves elsewhere in Greece, helots were collectively state-owned. They were tied to specific land plots. They could not be individually bought or sold, but this provided no practical protection from abuse. Each year, the Spartan ephors formally declared war on helots. This was a legal fiction. It made killing a helot technically an act of war rather than murder. It removed all legal liability. The cryptia was the enforcement mechanism. Young Spartan men were sent into the countryside armed with daggers. They were expected to kill any helots they encountered, particularly the strongest and most capable. Plutarch describes them specifically targeting helots out after dark or working in fields. The terror was designed to be constant. Men and women alike lived under it. Helot women were required to surrender roughly half of everything they produced while receiving none of the Spartan social system's benefits. Myron of Priene describes Spartans forcing helot women to undergo humiliation rituals and wear specific degrading clothing that marked their inferior status. Athenaeus records helot women compelled to attend Spartan drinking parties and perform. The implications are not explicitly stated but are widely inferred by historians. The helot to Spartan ratio is estimated at 7 to 1 or even 10 to 1. The entire Spartan military system was essentially designed to suppress a permanent internal threat. Thucydides records that in 424 BC, Spartans invited 2,000 distinguished helots to a freedom ceremony and then murdered all of them, fearing their capability. The family's fate is unrecorded. Helot women's reproductive capacity was effectively state-controlled. The system depended on a continuous labor supply. Children fathered by Spartan men on helot women, known as mothekes or nothoi, sometimes received partial Spartan education but never full citizenship. They constituted a permanent underclass. The Great Earthquake of 464 BC triggered a major helot revolt, suggesting the rage that simmered beneath Spartan control. It took years to suppress, followed by further reprisals. Spartan women, though famously liberated by Greek standards, owned helots themselves. Their relative freedom was built directly on helot women's subjugation. Epaminondas' liberation of Messenia in 370 to 369 BC, after the Battle of Leuctra, ended over 3 centuries of helot enslavement, but cultural and demographic damage was irreversible. The mainstream theory treats Helot enslavement as a unique form of state serfdom. Modern scholars draw direct parallels to apartheid and ethnic subjugation systems. A fringe theory argues that sources like Myron of Priene were biased anti-Spartan propagandists, and conditions may have been less extreme than the literary tradition suggests. If Sparta institutionalized captivity, the next conqueror on our list turned it into mythology. Number 7. Mass enslavement by Alexander the Great. The destruction of Thebes in 335 BC was Alexander's first major act of terror as king. 6,000 died in fighting. The entire surviving population, approximately 30,000 people, was sold into slavery. The sale generated 440 talents of silver. Alexander delegated the decision to allied Greeks who held old grudges against Thebes, the Phocians, and Plataeans. This allowed him plausible deniability while ensuring the most brutal outcome. Plutarch tells the story of Timoclea. A Thracian captain assaulted a Theban noblewoman. She lured him to a well with the promise of hidden gold, then pushed him in and crushed him with stones. Alexander released her. But her story is exceptional precisely because the vast majority of women had no such chance. The enslaved population of Thebes was dispersed across the Greek world. Women ended up in households from Sicily to the Black Sea coast. Thebes was so thoroughly erased, it was not refounded until 316 BC. At Persepolis in 330 BC, Alexander allowed his troops to plunder freely. Diodorus describes soldiers fighting each other over captive women, sometimes killing the women in disputes rather than relinquishing them. Curtius Rufus records women tearing their clothing and hair, pleading for mercy, being dragged away. At Tyre, after a 7-month siege in 332 BC, 2,000 men were crucified along the beach and 30,000 inhabitants enslaved, the majority women and children. At Gaza, the commander Batis was tied to a chariot and dragged around the city walls. The entire population was enslaved. The pattern was consistent. Cities that surrendered were treated relatively well. Cities that resisted faced exemplary violence. Women bore the long-term enslavement consequences while men were killed. The Macedonian army's camp followers included thousands of previously captive women taken as concubines. They formed a mobile enslaved population traveling 20,000 miles with the campaign. Alexander took Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman, as his wife after conquering Sogdiana. The power dynamic was inherently coercive. Barsine, widow of the Persian commander Memnon, was his concubine before Roxana. She bore him a son named Heracles who was murdered during the succession wars. Even at the highest levels, captive women's fates remained precarious. The burning of Persepolis destroyed archives, religious texts, and administrative records. It erased the voices that might have documented women's experiences from the Persian perspective. The mainstream theory holds that Alexander's violence was typical of ancient warfare. The revisionist theory argues that the mythologization of Alexander across subsequent centuries represents one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns. A fringe theory contends that ancient figures were wildly inflated by hostile sources. The historiographical erasure persists. Alexander is taught as a great explorer and unifier. The enslaved women of Thebes, Persepolis, Tyre, and Gaza remain unnamed footnotes. From the Mediterranean world, we move to Mesoamerica, where captivity merged with religion. Number 8. Ritual sacrifice and slavery by the Aztecs. Flower wars, called Xochiaoyotl, were prearranged battles fought primarily to capture prisoners for sacrifice rather than conquer territory. It was a military religious institution unique in world history. While male warriors were the primary capture targets, Aztec society maintained complex female slavery systems and ritual sacrifice of women that receive far less discussion. The festival of Ochpanistli involved a woman impersonating the goddess Tochi. She was dressed in regalia, danced with, and celebrated. Then she was killed and flayed in a ritual transformation from person to deity to raw material. The festival of Huitequilhuitl featured a woman representing the maize goddess Silunen, who was decapitated after days of ritual preparation, singing, and dancing. She was for sacrifice occupied the lowest category. They had no options. The Codex Mendoza depicts women taken as tribute from conquered towns, listed alongside cacao, textiles, and feathers. Human beings as line items. The slave market at Azcapotzalco was one of Mesoamerica's largest. Captive women were bought and sold openly. prices varied by age, appearance, and skills. Sahagún's Florentine Codex, compiled from Aztec informants after the Spanish conquest, details how female sacrifice victims were prepared, costumed, and ritually transformed into divine representations. The bathing slaves' ritual saw captives cleansed before sacrifice, then forced to dance and sing at the captor's home. Grief itself was instrumentalized. Mothers of children sacrificed to the rain god Tlaloc were expected to weep during ceremonies. Their tears held ritual significance. Captive women weavers produced elaborate textiles, one of the most valuable Mesoamerican commodities. Their skilled labor was economically essential but personally unrewarded. Pochteca, the long-distance merchants, traded enslaved people along routes from the Gulf Coast to Guatemala. Post-conquest sources present a dual problem. The Spanish had incentive to exaggerate, but archaeological evidence, including mass graves and skeletal trauma patterns, broadly corroborates the scale of sacrifice. The mainstream theory treats Aztec sacrifice as a complex religious political system with genuine theological underpinning. The archaeological theory confirms large-scale sacrifice at numbers lower than Spanish accounts claimed. A post-colonial theory argues Spanish chroniclers weaponized Aztec practices to justify their own genocidal conquest. The destruction of Aztec libraries by missionaries, notably Bishop Diego de Landa's book burnings in Maya territory, means any internal Aztec debate is permanently lost. From ritual sacrifice in the Americas, we travel to a civilization where cruelty was codified as theology. Number 9. Mutilation and convent imprisonment by the Byzantines. The Byzantine Empire employed mutilation as a formalized political tool for over 1,000 years. Rhinocopia, the cutting of noses, blinding, tongue removal, castration, all codified in law. The theological logic was specific. A mutilated person was considered unfit to rule because the emperor represented God's perfection on earth. Disfigurement became permanent political disqualification. Empress Irene of Athens, who ruled from 797 to 802, ordered the blinding of her own son Constantine VI in the same purple chamber where he had been born. The mutilation was so severe he likely died from it. Forced tonsure, the cutting of hair combined with convent confinement, was the Byzantine equivalent of a death sentence for political women. Empresses Euphrosyne and Theophano and countless noblewomen were disposed of this way. Convent imprisonment was not peaceful retreat. It meant lifetime confinement under strict surveillance. No outside contact. Sometimes harsh physical conditions. Decades of isolation while fully aware the world continued without them. Justinian II, after his own nose was cut off, earning the nickname Rhinometos, or slit-nosed, returned to power and inflicted savage reprisals, including the blinding and mutilation of enemies' families. Basil II, called the Bulgar Slayer, blinded 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers after the Battle of Cleidion in 1014. He left one-eyed guides for every 99 blinded men. Tsar Samuel reportedly died of shock upon seeing them return. Women of the Byzantine imperial family were frequently used as diplomatic currency. They were married off to foreign rulers, confined to convents, or mutilated to remove them from succession disputes. Adultery punishment for women in Byzantine law was nose-slitting, a visible permanent mark designed to make the woman unmarriageable and socially dead. Palace eunuchs numbered in the thousands. They were created by castrating boys, often captives or slaves, with high mortality. Women in the imperial household lived surrounded by these living testimonies to institutional brutality. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204 brought Western Crusaders assaulting Byzantine women on a massive scale. Nikitas Choniates describes nuns attacked in churches and noblewomen dragged through streets. These were fellow Christians attacking fellow Christians. Byzantine iconoclasm from 726 to 843 created persecution of women supporting icon veneration. Nuns and abbesses were publicly beaten, imprisoned, and forced to marry against their will. The mainstream theory calls Byzantine mutilation a pragmatic alternative to execution. The historical theory argues the system reveals how theological concepts were weaponized into bureaucratic cruelty. A fringe theory contends that Western historians exaggerated Byzantine brutality as part of anti-Eastern bias. From the Byzantine court to the Roman arena, we reach the final entry, where all systems of captivity converged into public spectacle. Number 10. Women killed as public entertainment by the Romans. Evidence for women in the arena comes from multiple source types. Literary references in Martial, Juvenal, Cassius Dio, and Suetonius. Inscriptions. A marble relief from Halicarnassus. And legal texts that attempted to ban the practice. The variety of evidence is itself significant. This was not an isolated phenomenon. Martial's Liber Spectacularum, written for the Colosseum's opening in 80 AD, describes a woman fighting in the arena. He compared her to mythological warriors. Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 AD, staged fights between women and dwarfs by torchlight as after-dinner entertainment. Both Cassius Dio and Suetonius reference these spectacles independently. The Halicarnassus marble relief depicts two female gladiators named Amazon and Achillea fighting with swords and shields. They are shown bareheaded, without helmets. The display was deliberate. Emperor Nero had women of senatorial families perform in the arena. This was deliberate class degradation. Cassius Dio records Ethiopian women forced to fight wild animals under Nero. Race and gender combined to determine who faced the most extreme spectacles. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts applied to both sexes. Captive women convicted or designated for execution were exposed naked to lions, bears, or other animals before audiences of 50,000. Fatal charades forced women to reenact mythology. Tertullian describes a woman forced to play the role of Dirce, tied to the horns of a bull. The Colosseum's underground, the Hippodrome, contained elaborate machinery, trapdoors, and lifts that could deliver captive women into the arena from below. Theatrical surprise was added to public death. A 2012 archaeological analysis of a female burial at Great Dover Street in London found evidence consistent with a female gladiator. Expensive grave goods were found alongside lamp images of a fallen gladiator. Emperor Septimius Severus banned female gladiatorial combat in 200 AD. The ban paradoxically confirmed it had been widespread enough to require legal prohibition. The Passion of Perpetua and Felicity, dating to 203 AD, describes two women stripped, exposed to a wild cow, and stabbed by gladiators. The crowd initially recoiled. It is one of the rare recorded moments of audience discomfort in arena history. The mainstream theory treats female gladiators as rare curiosities. The archaeological theory, bolstered by the London burial and the Halicarnassus relief, suggests female participation was far more common. A fringe theory argues Christian martyrdom accounts exaggerated arena violence to build persecution narratives. The arena represents the intersection of all Roman exploitation systems. Military conquest produced captives. The slave market sorted them. The legal system condemned them. And the arena consumed them. These 10 entries raise a structural question: why were these women erased from history in the first place? The common thread is this: captive women were extensively documented in administrative and economic records, ration tablets, tribute rolls, sales receipts, but they were almost never present in narrative history. They were accounting entries, not characters. Every civilization discussed produced its own propaganda: Assyrian reliefs, Roman triumphal arches, Mongol chronicles, Aztec codices. All framed captive taking exclusively from the captor's perspective. Historian after historian is now identifying what they call historiographical erasure. Knowledge was not always destroyed. It was simply never considered important enough to frame as women's experience. Literacy asymmetry deepened the problem. Captive women were overwhelmingly illiterate or denied access to writing in their captors' languages. They could not produce counter-narratives. Nationalist mythologization did the rest. Vikings became adventurers. Alexander became a hero. Spartans became freedom fighters. Each mythology required erasing the enslaved women who made the system function. Religious reframing contributed further. Byzantine cruelty was folded into stories of Christian civilization. Aztec sacrifice was weaponized to justify Spanish conquest. The survival of administrative documents provides an accidentally preserved record. Cuneiform tablets, tribute rolls, and ration lists were never intended as testimony. Accountants documented what storytellers ignored. Archaeological sites associated with captive populations, deportee settlements, slave quarters, and mass graves received systematically less funding and attention than palaces, temples, and battlefields. The paradox of survival is that some of the best evidence for captive women's experience comes from their captors' boastful records. Recovery requires reading perpetrator documents against the grain. Modern science is now changing what we can know. Mitochondrial DNA inherited exclusively from mothers provides a direct biological record of female migration and captivity that no written source can match. It is effectively captive women's unwritten testimony. The 2003 Genghis Khan Y chromosome study proved reproductive coercion at civilizational scale, but the complementary maternal DNA story is only now being studied. The 2018 science study on Viking-era Scandinavian genetics found reduced female genetic diversity compared to males. This directly demonstrates the importation of captive women from abroad. Strontium isotope analysis of teeth can determine where a person grew up based on local geological signatures. Applied to female skeletons from Viking, Roman, and Mongol-era sites, it reveals women who grew up hundreds or thousands of miles from where they died. The Ridgeway Hill mass grave in Dorset, with 54 decapitated males and no females, combined with isotope analysis confirmed the men were Scandinavian. The absence of women is itself data. Skeletal trauma analysis on female remains from conflict zones reveals patterns consistent with captivity, healed fractures, malnutrition markers, repetitive stress injuries from forced labor. The emerging field of paleogenomics of coercion attempts to quantify forced reproduction through genetic bottleneck analysis. The Icelandic genetic paradox is striking. A population that identifies as Norse shows roughly 60% cultic maternal lineage. The descendants of thrall women now constitute the majority of a nation that tells Viking stories. Epigenetic studies, examining how genes are expressed rather than just inherited, may eventually reveal biological signatures of extreme stress in ancient remains. For the first time in human history, we have tools that can recover the biological stories of people who were denied the ability to tell their own. The economic dimension binds all of this together. Captive women's labor was not incidental to ancient economies. It was foundational. Textile production was the ancient world's most labor-intensive commodity. A single garment could require hundreds of hours of spinning, weaving, and dyeing. Captive women performed this work across every civilization discussed. In the Assyrian Empire, captive weavers produced the textiles that were primary long-distance trade commodities. The economic output of enslaved weavers directly funded military campaigns that captured more weavers. A self-feeding cycle. The Viking wool trade depended heavily on thrall women's labor. The expansion of Norse textile exports correlates directly with increased slave-taking. In the Mongol Empire, captured craftswomen were specifically separated and transported to Karakorum precisely because their economic value was recognized. The concept of reproductive labor as economic production is central. Captive women bore the next generation of laborers, soldiers, and citizens. This was a form of production that was exploited but never compensated or acknowledged as productive. Helot women's agricultural output, surrendering roughly half of production, directly subsidized the Spartan military system. Sparta's famous army was effectively funded by coerced female agricultural labor. The trans-Saharan slave trade calculated the cost of transporting enslaved women across the desert against expected sale prices. Acceptable mortality rates were factored into profit margins. Three economic frameworks compete. The mainstream view treats captive women's labor as significant but one factor among many. The revisionist view argues coerced female labor was the single largest uncompensated economic input in the ancient world. The speculative view suggests that if this labor were quantified at market rates, the GDP of ancient civilizations would require fundamental recalculation. The structural patterns documented across these 10 civilizations are not historical curiosities. They are recurring templates. ISIS's enslavement of Yazidi women after 2014 explicitly used religious justification for concubinage in language directly paralleling historical precedents, including published price lists for women based on age. The Rwandan genocide of 1994 involved systematic sexual violence against Tutsi women. An estimated 250,000 to 500,000 women were assaulted with the intent to destroy group identity through forced reproduction. The comfort women system of Imperial Japan, operating from 1932 to 1945, involved an estimated 200,000 women forced into sexual slavery. It was a state-administered system with bureaucratic documentation resembling Assyrian administrative tablets. The Bosnian War saw systematic detention and assault of women in camps designed specifically for that purpose. It became the first conflict where sexual violence was prosecuted as a crime against humanity. Modern human trafficking continues. The United Nations estimates 4.8 million people are in forced sexual exploitation globally. Women and girls comprise the overwhelming majority. The international legal framework for protecting captive women is remarkably recent. The Rome Statute of 2002 establishing the International Criminal Court was the first permanent international mechanism for prosecuting sexual violence in conflict. 3. Interpretive frameworks persist. The mainstream view holds that modern law represents genuine progress. The structural view argues that identical patterns across millennia suggest captive taking is a structural feature, not an aberration. The pessimistic view contends that human rights frameworks are performative, prosecuting the defeated while ignoring ongoing captivity by powerful states. Return to the image that opened this documentary: a cuneiform tablet listing women alongside grain and livestock, an accountant's record that accidentally became testimony. The physical evidence, bones, DNA, isotopes, administrative records, remembers what narrative history chose to forget. Across 3,000 years and 10 civilizations, the technical methods of captivity evolved, but the structural logic remained constant. The women in these records were not abstractions. They had names that were recorded only as inventory entries. Skills noted only for their economic value. Origins tracked only for administrative purposes. Modern science is recovering their biological stories for the first time. But biology alone cannot reconstruct experience. 3 final perspectives. The optimistic view holds that recovery of these histories represents progress. The realistic view notes the patterns continue in documented modern conflicts, limiting claims of civilizational advancement. The uncomfortable view observes that the civilizations we celebrate, Greek, Roman, Norse, Mongol, Aztec, were built on foundations we have chosen not to examine closely. The ration tablets, the DNA profiles, the skeletal trauma, the reliefs carved in stone by captors who never imagined anyone would read them as testimony for the captive. These are what remain. The gap between what was recorded and what was experienced is the largest gap in all of human history. We are only beginning to measure it. These stories were not erased by accident. They were never written in the first place. The people who could write did not consider them stories worth telling.